"I can warm you tonight," said Apache girl. And the rancher let her stay. The winter wind howled across the desert, sweeping through the dry, barren plains like a restless spirit. The once vibrant land had become a quiet, empty place, the sound of nature itself feeling like a lonely echo. There was no one around for miles, just the distant mountains on the horizon, covered in snow and shadows. In the middle of this vast emptiness stood a small, humble ranch. It was the home of a man who had lived here for many years, tending to his cattle and the land. He was a man used to being alone. His name was Jack, and he had long since lost track of time. His life was simple, even predictable. Each day was much like the last, waking up before dawn, tending to the cattle, fixing fences, and caring for the land. There was no one to talk to, no one to share the silence with. The long hours of solitude had become his life, and he was comfortable with it. But tonight, something felt different. The air was colder than usual, and the wind seemed to carry a heavier weight. He could feel the storm coming, the kind of storm that could change everything. Jack wasn't one to worry about much. He had seen his fair share of storms over the years, but this one felt different. It was as if the very land itself was preparing for something. The cattle had been restless all day, pacing around the fields, uneasy. Jack had spent the afternoon checking the barn, making sure everything was secure, but deep down he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. As evening fell, the ranch was bathed in a soft golden light, the last rays of the sun slipping behind the mountains. Jack stood at the doorway of the barn, watching as the wind began to pick up. He pulled his coat tighter around him, feeling the cold seep into his bones. He knew he needed to go inside soon, but the sky above him was so beautiful. The storm was still far off, but it was coming. He could feel it in his chest. Then, out of nowhere, he heard it. A faint sound, barely noticeable at first. It was a cry, soft but clear, carried on the wind. Jack turned quickly, looking toward the direction of the sound. It was coming from the road, the only path that led to his ranch. His heart skipped a beat as he listened more closely. The wind was howling louder now, but the cry came again. This time, it was unmistakable. A person, someone in distress. Jack didn't hesitate. He grabbed his coat and hat and made his way toward the road. The snow had begun to fall lightly at first, dusting the ground with a thin layer of white. As he walked, he called out, but the only response was the wind. The cry had stopped, leaving only the sounds of the storm. He quickened his pace, his boots crunching in the snow. The road was empty. The only tracks in the snow were those of the cattle he had moved earlier. But then, through the swirling snow, he saw something. Someone, moving slowly, struggling against the wind. A figure, hunched and stumbling, barely visible against the whiteness of the storm. Jack's heart raced as he closed the distance. He called out again, this time with urgency. "Hey, are you okay?" His voice barely carried over the wind, but the figure turned and Jack saw her. A woman, her face pale and strained with exhaustion, her clothes torn and soaked by the snow. She was young, perhaps in her early 20s, and she looked as if she had been walking for miles. Her eyes met his for just a moment, wide with fear and confusion. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came. She swayed on her feet, barely able to keep her balance. Jack rushed forward, catching her just as her legs gave way. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her steady. "It's okay, I've got you," he said, his voice softer now, trying to calm her. The woman looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude but also with fear. She was trembling, not just from the cold, but from something deeper. Jack could feel it, an overwhelming sense of fear, a kind of desperation in the way she clung to him. She was in trouble, and he knew it. He had seen enough in his time to recognize the signs. "Come with me," Jack said, his voice firm yet gentle. He led her toward the ranch, guiding her through the snow, his hand on her back making sure she didn't fall. The wind howled around them, but Jack barely noticed it now. His focus was entirely on the woman, on getting her inside out of the cold. He had no idea who she was or where she had come from, but she needed help. That was all that mattered. When they reached the barn, Jack opened the door and helped her inside. The warmth of the barn hit them both, a sharp contrast to the bitter cold outside. The cattle were already huddled together, seeking shelter from the storm, and Jack quickly closed the door behind them, shutting out the worst of the wind and snow. "Can I get you anything?" Jack asked, his concern growing. The woman was still trembling, her face pale, her clothes soaked through. He didn't know what to do, but he knew he had to do something. The woman shook her head weakly, still not speaking. She looked down at the ground, as if lost in thought. Jack didn't push her. Instead, he went to a small stove in the corner of the barn and started a fire. The warmth began to fill the space, and Jack felt the tension in his shoulders start to ease. He turned back to the woman, who was still standing by the door looking out at the storm. She hadn't moved since they came inside. Jack felt a pang of worry. "You don't have to be afraid," he said gently. "You're safe here." The woman finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know where else to go." Her words were simple, but they carried so much weight. Jack's heart went out to her. "You can stay here as long as you need," Jack said without hesitation. "There's a bed in the house, and you're welcome to it. I don't mind the company." She turned toward him then, her eyes filled with something, relief perhaps, or exhaustion. It was hard to tell. But she nodded, a small gesture that spoke volumes. Jack made his way to the house, gathering some blankets and a warm meal. He couldn't help but wonder who this woman was, how she had ended up in such a condition. But for now, he didn't ask questions. There would be time for that later. As he returned to the barn, he found the woman seated near the fire, her eyes closed as if she had already drifted into a peaceful sleep. He set the blankets down gently beside her. She looked up at him, offering a weak but grateful smile. "I'm Jack," he said quietly, "and you're welcome to stay here for as long as you need." She nodded again, her voice soft but steady. "Thank you, Jack." "My name is Rose." Jack smiled, relieved that she had finally spoken. He didn't know what had brought her to his ranch, but he knew one thing for certain. He was going to help her, no matter what. The storm raged outside, but inside the barn there was a warmth that neither of them had felt in a long time. The loneliness of the desert seemed far away now, replaced by the quiet comfort of two strangers finding solace in each other's company. Jack didn't know it yet, that this night would change everything. It would mark the beginning of a story neither of them could have predicted. A story of trust, of healing, and perhaps even something more. But for now, all that mattered was that Rose was safe, and Jack was no longer alone. The next morning, Jack woke up to the sound of the wind still howling outside. The storm hadn't passed yet, and the snow was thick on the ground, covering everything in a blanket of white. Jack had grown used to the winters in this part of the country, but today felt different. There was a quiet in the house that he hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't alone. He could hear the faint sound of Rose moving around in the barn, and a strange sense of comfort settled over him. As he made his way to the barn, he saw Rose sitting by the fire, staring into the flames. She looked peaceful, but there was a sadness in her eyes that Jack couldn't ignore. It was as if the storm inside her hadn't stopped, even though the one outside was beginning to fade. He had already figured out that she wasn't just running from the storm. There was something more to her story, something she wasn't ready to share. Jack didn't want to push her, but he also knew that she needed to talk. Maybe not today, but soon. For now, he focused on getting her settled. He had lived most of his life in solitude, but taking care of someone else, especially someone in need, felt like the right thing to do. "Morning," Jack said, stepping into the warmth of the barn. The smell of the fire and the faint scent of Rose's clothes mixed with the earthy aroma of the barn. It felt like home, and for once, he didn't mind it. Rose turned her head slowly, her eyes still distant but soft. "Morning," she replied quietly, her voice still rough from the cold. Her cheeks were rosy, but her expression was still somber, as though she was lost in her thoughts. Jack offered her a warm smile, trying to put her at ease. "You slept well?" She nodded, though it seemed like she wasn't entirely sure herself. "Yes, thank you for the blankets." "It's no trouble," Jack said, setting a small basket of bread and cheese on a nearby table. "I thought you might be hungry." Rose's stomach growled in response, and she chuckled softly, a sound that made Jack feel a little lighter. She stood up slowly and walked over to the table, reaching for the bread. The fire crackled behind her as she took a bite, her movements careful and deliberate, as though she wasn't used to something so simple. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The storm outside seemed to calm, though the silence inside the barn was heavy.
Jack didn't mind it, though. He was used to quiet.
But Rose seemed like she needed more than just quiet. She needed comfort, and Jack couldn't help but feel that he might be the one to give it to her. "So, what brings you out here?" Jack finally asked, his voice gentle but curious. He had been wondering since he found her in the storm, but he didn't want to force her to talk if she wasn't ready. He simply needed to know how he could help her more. Rose didn't look up from her bread at first. She picked at the edges, slowly tearing off small pieces. She seemed lost in thought, her mind racing with words she hadn't yet found the courage to say. Jack waited patiently, giving her the space she needed. I ran away," she said softly, the words barely above a whisper. "I didn't know where to go. My family—"
"They didn't want me anymore."
Jack could hear the pain in her voice, the weight of her words. His heart ached for her, but he didn't know how to fix it. He had never been good at comforting people. He was more of a doer than a talker. But this was different. This wasn't about fixing things. It was about listening, about offering a safe space. "I'm sorry to hear that," Jack said quietly, his voice full of understanding. "Family can be complicated sometimes. But you don't have to worry. You're safe here." Rose nodded but didn't speak. She looked up at Jack for a moment, as if trying to decide whether she should trust him with more of her story. But then she lowered her gaze again, staring at the half-eaten bread in her hands. She was still unsure, still carrying the weight of whatever had driven her to leave everything behind. Jack didn't press her further. He knew she wasn't ready to share everything just yet, but he also knew that in time she would. He had a way of being patient when it mattered, and right now it mattered more than anything. "Do you need help with anything?" Jack asked, trying to shift the focus. He didn't want to push her, but he wanted to be helpful. She was his guest, and he wanted to make sure she felt as comfortable as possible. Rose shook her head slowly. "No, I'm all right for now." "Thank you, though." Jack nodded, accepting her response without any judgment. He could tell she wasn't one to ask for help easily, and that was okay. In his years of solitude, he had learned the importance of letting people be when they needed space. Sometimes all a person needed was time to heal on their own terms. The morning passed slowly, the storm outside gradually fading into nothing more than a distant memory. Jack worked on small tasks around the ranch, repairing a fence that had been damaged by the wind and checking on the cattle. He could see Rose from the barn as she moved around, quietly watching him work. She hadn't offered much conversation, but her presence was a comfort, a quiet reminder that he wasn't alone anymore. Later in the afternoon, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, Jack returned to the barn to check on Rose. He found her sitting by the fire again, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the flames. She looked peaceful, but there was still a weight in her eyes that hadn't lifted. Jack knew she was struggling, but he also knew that she wasn't ready to share everything with him. Not yet. "Do you want to go for a walk?" Jack asked, breaking the silence. "The storm's gone now. We could take a look at the ranch, see how the cattle are doing." Rose looked up at him, considering his offer. She was hesitant at first, but after a moment she nodded. "I think I'd like that," she said, her voice soft. They left the warmth of the barn together and stepped out into the crisp evening air. The world was quiet now, the snow untouched by footprints. The ranch, normally a place of solitude, felt different with Rose beside him. It wasn't the same as before. Jack could sense that there was a bond forming between them, something unspoken but real. They walked in silence, Jack keeping a few paces ahead, letting Rose take her time. She seemed to be taking in everything from the wide open spaces to the distant mountains. He could tell she was processing, still unsure of what her next step should be. Jack didn't rush her. He let her have the space to think, to breathe in the fresh air, and to feel the world around her. As they reached the edge of the ranch where the cattle grazed quietly in the snow, Rose stopped. She stood there for a moment, watching the animals, and then looked over at Jack. "This place is peaceful," she said, her voice quieter now. "I didn't expect it to feel so safe." Jack smiled softly. "It's not much, but it's home," he said. Rose turned toward him, her expression more relaxed than it had been since he found her in the storm.
"Thank you, Jack, for everything," she said, her eyes full of gratitude.
Jack nodded, a simple acknowledgement of her thanks. He didn't need anything in return. He was just glad to help. The evening sky was turning dark, and the stars began to appear above them, twinkling in the vast expanse of the night. As they walked back to the barn, Jack felt a shift inside him. It was subtle, but it was there. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel so alone. Rose had brought something into his life that he hadn't realized he needed. Hope. A reminder that sometimes, even in the darkest times, there was light. When they reached the barn, Rose paused for a moment, then turned to Jack. "I think I'll stay for a while," she said, her voice steady. "I don't know what I'll do yet, but I feel better here. I feel safe." Jack nodded. "You can stay as long as you need," he said. "There's no rush." And so, for the first time in a long time, both Jack and Rose found something they hadn't realized they were looking for. A place to rest, a place to heal, and the beginning of a story neither of them could have predicted. Days passed quietly at the ranch. The storm had long since faded into a memory, but the calm it left behind seemed to linger. Jack and Rose settled into a routine, one that was simple but comforting. Jack continued with his work around the ranch, repairing fences, feeding the cattle, and making sure everything was in order. Rose, for her part, helped out where she could. She wasn't used to the physical work, but she took to it with a quiet determination. She cleaned the barn, helped with the cooking, and even fed the chickens. She never complained, even when the work was hard. In the mornings, after the chores were done, the two of them would sit on the porch, looking out at the vast plains. Jack enjoyed these moments of quiet. He wasn't one for long conversations, but there was something peaceful about sitting next to someone without needing to speak. Rose, too, seemed to find comfort in the silence. But every once in a while she would turn to Jack and ask a question, a small way of reaching out. "How long have you been here?" she asked one morning, the sun still low in the sky, casting long shadows on the ground. Jack thought for a moment before answering. "Long enough to know it's where I'm meant to be," he said simply. Rose looked at him for a moment, her brow furrowing as she thought about his words. "Is it lonely?" she asked softly, her voice hesitant, as if she was afraid to bring up something so personal. Jack shrugged, his gaze still fixed on the horizon.
"It can be, but it's also peaceful."
"I've learned to appreciate the quiet." Rose nodded, as if she understood. She didn't say anything else, but Jack could tell that her mind was working, processing everything she had experienced since arriving at the ranch. She had been quiet lately, more so than usual, and Jack knew she was still trying to make sense of things. Her past was something she kept locked away, and Jack didn't push her to talk about it. He had learned a long time ago that people needed their space, especially when they were carrying something heavy. As the days turned into weeks, Rose began to open up a little more. It was subtle at first, small gestures, a kind word here and there. But Jack noticed the changes. She would smile more often, and when she did, there was a warmth in it that hadn't been there before. The sadness in her eyes, the one that had been so evident when he first met her, had begun to fade, replaced by something softer, something that hinted at hope. One afternoon after they had finished their work for the day, Jack went to the barn to check on the cattle. He had just finished checking the fences when he heard Rose's voice calling to him. He turned to see her standing by the barn door, looking out at the horizon. "Jack," she said, her tone serious, "I've been thinking. I want to do more. I don't want to just be a guest here. I want to help, really help. You've done so much for me already, and I haven't really given anything back." Jack walked over to her, his boots crunching in the snow. He could see the determination in her eyes, the same look she had when she first arrived at the ranch. It wasn't the look of someone who was lost or broken. It was the look of someone who was ready to take control of her own life again. "You don't have to do anything," Jack said gently. "You're already helping just by being here. But if you want to pitch in more, I won't stop you. There's always something that needs doing." Rose smiled, the first real smile Jack had seen in days. "I want to learn. I want to know how to do the things you do." Jack chuckled softly, a little surprised by her enthusiasm. "It's not exactly easy work," he said, but the smile on her face told him that she was determined. The next few days were filled with Rose learning the ropes of ranch life. Jack taught her how to care for the cattle, how to check the fences, how to patch up the roof of the barn when it needed fixing. She took to the work quickly, her natural strength and resilience shining through. It wasn't easy, and there were days when she felt exhausted, but Jack could see that she was growing stronger, both physically and emotionally. As she spent more time with the animals, Jack noticed something else. Rose had a natural way with them, a gentleness that calmed the cattle and made the chores go faster. It was something Jack hadn't expected, but he found himself admiring it. Rose had a quiet strength, a kind of patience that made everything seem less daunting. One evening, as they sat by the fire after a long day's work, Rose spoke again, her voice thoughtful. "I never thought I'd find something like this," she said, looking into the flames. "I thought I'd always be running, always looking for something I couldn't find. But here with you, I feel like I've finally found a place to stop, to breathe."
Jack listened quietly, the fire crackling in the background.
He didn't have the right words to say, but he understood what she meant. They had both been running in their own ways. He had run from his past, from his own pain, and Rose had been running from something much darker. But here, in the quiet of the ranch, they had both found something they hadn't realized they needed: peace. "I'm glad you found it here," Jack said finally, his voice low. "I'm glad you decided to stay." Rose looked up at him then, her eyes soft. "I'm glad too," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what comes next, but for now this feels right." And for the first time in a long while, Jack felt the same way. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't alone anymore. The next few weeks went by in a blur. The ranch was alive with activity, the work never ending but always manageable with Rose by his side. They became a team, not just in the chores but in the way they shared the silence, the way they communicated without words. It was an unspoken bond, one that neither of them had expected, but both of them needed. One morning, as Jack was walking out to check the cattle, he saw Rose standing by the barn door again, looking out at the horizon. But this time, she wasn't alone. She was holding a small bundle of hay, and the cows had gathered around her, nuzzling her gently as if they knew her now, as if they trusted her. Jack smiled to himself as he watched her. She had found her place, just as he had found his. There was a connection between them now, something deep and unspoken, and it was enough to make the world feel a little less lonely. Rose turned to him, a slight smile on her face. "I think I'm finally starting to feel like this is home," she said, her voice filled with contentment. Jack nodded. "I think it's starting to feel that way for both of us." As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the ranch became more than just a place to live. It became a home, a place where both Jack and Rose had found something they had been searching for all their lives: peace, belonging, and a sense of purpose. As the seasons passed, the ranch became a place of steady rhythm. The days were long, filled with hard work and quiet moments. Jack and Rose had settled into a comfortable routine, one that brought a sense of peace to both of them. For Jack, it was a sense of contentment he hadn't felt in years. The constant work kept his mind busy, but it was the companionship of Rose that truly made the difference. They worked side by side, each day a little easier than the one before. But even with the calm of daily life, there were moments when the weight of the past would resurface, when the old wounds would stir, Jack could feel it in the way Rose would sometimes look off into the distance, her expression distant and unreadable. He knew she was carrying something that still haunted her, but she wasn't ready to talk about it. And Jack respected that. He knew what it was like to keep things buried, to carry them silently. One evening, after they had finished the evening chores and the last light of the day had faded, Jack found himself standing at the edge of the ranch, looking out at the open plains. The air was cool, the sky painted with the colors of the setting sun. Rose came up beside him, her boots crunching in the gravel as she approached. "You're quiet tonight," Jack said, turning to look at her. He could tell there was something on her mind. Rose nodded, her eyes still focused on the horizon. "I've been thinking about what comes next," she said, her voice soft but steady. Jack waited for her to continue. He didn't want to rush her, but he could sense the uncertainty in her words. It was the same kind of uncertainty he had felt when he first came to this ranch, when he wasn't sure if he was running towards something or running away.
What do you mean?
He asked, keeping his tone gentle, allowing her the space to speak freely. "I've been here for a while now," Rose said slowly, her voice carrying a hint of hesitation. "And I'm grateful for everything you've done for me. But I can't stay here forever. I need to figure out what's next for me." Jack nodded, understanding the feeling. He had always known that Rose was running from something. She had arrived at his ranch with no destination, just a need for refuge. And now, as she had grown stronger, as the shadows of her past had begun to fade, it seemed she was ready to face whatever came next. "You don't have to stay if you don't want to," Jack said, his voice steady. "But I want you to know that you have a place here whenever you need it." Rose smiled, but it was a sad smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes.
I know. I've never felt more at home than I do here.
"But I don't know if I can keep running from my past forever. I need to face it, to figure out who I really am now, and what kind of future I want." Jack didn't say anything at first. He understood the need to confront the past. He had done it himself, in his own way. The years he spent on the ranch had been about building something for himself, but they had also been about healing, about facing the parts of himself that he had tried to leave behind.
"You're stronger than you think," Jack finally said. "You've made it this far."
"Whatever happens next, I know you'll be all right." Rose looked at him, her eyes softening. "Thank you, Jack, for everything." Jack gave her a small smile, his heart warmed by her words. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew that their paths had crossed for a reason. Whether Rose stayed or went, the bond they had formed would always remain. As the night fell and the stars began to appear in the sky, Jack and Rose stood in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The ranch, the place that had brought them both a sense of peace, was now a symbol of the changes they had both gone through. It wasn't just a place to live. It was a place where they had found themselves, even if they hadn't realized it at first. The next few days were filled with the usual chores, but there was an air of quiet tension that hung between Jack and Rose. Rose had been distant, her thoughts clearly focused on what she had said to Jack that evening. She had always been a woman of few words, but now she seemed to be processing something deeper, something that was still unsettled inside her. Jack didn't ask her what was going through her mind. He knew she needed space, and he respected that. But he could see the way her eyes would occasionally wander to the distant mountains, as if she was searching for something beyond the ranch, beyond the life they had built together. Jack had always been a man who lived in the present, who focused on the work in front of him. But he could see that Rose was looking toward the future, trying to figure out where she belonged. One morning as they sat down to breakfast, Rose spoke again, her voice quiet but firm. "I've decided," she said, looking up at Jack. "I'm going to leave." Jack looked at her, surprised but not shocked. He had known this moment would come. Rose had always been a traveler at heart, even if she hadn't admitted it to herself. She had come to the ranch to heal, but now she was ready to move on, to find the next chapter in her life. "I understand," Jack said, his voice steady, though he felt a pang of sadness in his chest. He had grown to care for Rose, and the thought of her leaving made the silence of the ranch feel even more profound. "I'm not leaving because I don't want to be here," Rose continued, her voice softening. "This place, you Everything has given me more than I could ever ask for. But I have to do this. I have to find my own way." Jack nodded, his eyes meeting hers. He knew this was the right decision for her. She had come to the ranch as a lost soul, unsure of where she was going, but now she was ready to take the next step, to face whatever the future held for her. "I'll be all right," Rose said, her voice quiet but full of determination. "I just need to figure out who I am without running away from my past." Jack reached across the table, his hand resting lightly on hers. "You'll always have a place here, Rose, and if you ever need anything, you know where to find me." Tears welled up in Rose's eyes, but she didn't cry. Instead, she gave him a small, grateful smile, her hand tightening around his. "Thank you, Jack, for everything." As the days passed, the preparations for Rose's departure began. Jack helped her pack, though there wasn't much to pack. She had very little when she arrived, and now, after spending several months at the ranch, she was ready to move on with what little she had. They spent their final days together in a quiet kind of peace, each knowing that their time together was coming to an end. On the morning she left, Rose stood at the edge of the ranch, looking back at Jack one last time. The sun had just risen, casting a warm glow over the plains. Jack stood a few steps behind her, watching as she turned to face him. "Goodbye, Jack," she said softly, her voice carrying a note of finality. "Goodbye, Rose," Jack replied, his voice steady, though his heart ached. And with that, Rose walked away from the ranch, leaving behind the life they had shared. Jack watched her go, knowing that she was ready to face whatever came next. And as the wind blew gently across the plains, Jack felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had helped her find herself, and now it was time for her to continue her journey. As the ranch grew quiet once again, Jack knew that life would go on, but it would never be the same. The time he had spent with Rose had changed him, and he knew that the memories of their time together would stay with him forever. The days after Rose left were quieter than Jack had anticipated. The ranch, which had felt full of life just weeks ago, seemed empty now. The wind still whispered through the tall grass, and the sound of the cattle in the fields was a familiar, comforting noise. But something was missing. Jack didn't realize how much Rose had changed the rhythm of his life until she was gone. There was a stillness that lingered in the air, as if even the land itself was mourning her departure. At first, Jack threw himself into his work even more than usual. There were always tasks to keep him busy, fences to mend, the barn to clean, cattle to feed. It was work that kept his hands moving and his mind focused. But there were moments when he would stop, in the middle of a task, and look around. It was in those quiet moments that he missed Rose the most. She had been a part of his daily life for so long, even in the background, that now her absence felt sharp. There was no one to share the silence with. No one to pass the long hours with, just as he had done before she arrived. But he knew that Rose had needed to leave, to find her own way, and though he missed her, he understood why she had made that decision. Jack had spent many years living on his own, and in a way he had always believed that solitude was his choice. But now he saw how much of it had been shaped by fear, by his own hesitation to let anyone in. Rose had come into his life when he hadn't expected it, and though she had left, she had brought something he hadn't even known he needed, a sense of connection. Weeks passed, and Jack continued his routine, but the peace he had once felt in solitude seemed harder to find. There were times when he would hear the sound of footsteps in the barn, or catch a glimpse of movement in the corner of his eye, and for a brief moment he would expect to see Rose there. But each time, he was reminded that she was gone, that she was on her own path now. One evening, as the sun began to set and the sky turned a deep shade of orange, Jack sat on the porch watching the cattle graze in the distance. The air was cooler now, and the days were getting shorter. It was a peaceful evening, but the quiet was heavy. Jack didn't feel lonely in the way he once had, but there was a certain emptiness that remained. He had always known that the ranch would be his life, that he would continue to work the land and care for the cattle, but now he wondered if there was more to life than this routine.
As he sat there, lost in thought, he heard the sound of hooves approaching in the distance.
Jack stood up slowly, his eyes squinting against the setting sun as he tried to make out the figure on horseback. At first he thought it was just another rider passing by, but as the rider drew closer, Jack's heart skipped a beat. It was Rose. She rode toward him, her posture steady and confident, just as he had remembered her. Her horse moved at a slow, deliberate pace, as if the animal itself knew the weight of the moment. When Rose finally reached the porch, she stopped and dismounted, her face calm but tired, as if she had been traveling for some time. "Rose?" Jack asked, his voice quiet but filled with surprise. "What are you doing here?" Rose looked at him, her expression soft but serious. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," she said, "about having a place here. And I realized that I wasn't ready to leave this part of my life behind just yet." Jack stood still, unsure of what to say. He had never expected her to return. After all, she had made her decision to leave, and Jack had respected that. But now, seeing her here again, he couldn't deny the rush of emotions that came with her return. "I'm glad you're back," Jack said simply, his voice warm and honest. He didn't need to say more. His heart was telling him everything he needed to know. Rose smiled faintly, her eyes meeting his. "I've learned a lot in the time I've been away. I thought I had to leave everything behind to figure out who I was. But I think what I needed most was already here, on this land, with you." Jack's heart swelled in his chest as he heard her words. He had never expected to hear them, but now that she had spoken them, it felt like everything had come full circle. He had spent so many years thinking that he was fine on his own, but now he realized how much Rose had changed his life. She had brought a warmth to the ranch, a sense of belonging that he hadn't known he needed. Rose looked around the ranch, her eyes taking in the familiar surroundings. "I've missed this place," she said softly. "And I've missed you." Jack took a step forward, reaching out and placing a hand on her shoulder. "I missed you too," he admitted, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I didn't know how much until you were gone." For a moment they stood there, the only sound the gentle rustling of the wind and the distant calls of the cattle. It was a quiet moment, but it spoke volumes. "I'm not asking you to stay because you owe me anything," Jack said, his hand still resting on her shoulder. "But if you want to stay, if this is where you belong, then you're welcome here. You always have been." Rose looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I don't need to go anywhere else anymore," she said quietly. "This is where I belong." And in that moment everything felt right. The ranch, once a place of solitude and silence, had become a home again. A place where two people who had once been lost in their own worlds had found something together. They didn't need to say more. The decision had already been made. They had both found what they had been searching for, without even realizing it. In the days that followed, things felt different, but in a good way. Jack and Rose worked side by side, not as strangers or people just passing through, but as partners, both in work and in life. The ranch was still a place of hard work, of daily chores and routines, but there was a lightness now, a sense of shared purpose. They had become a team, and that made everything easier, more fulfilling. Jack found himself looking forward to each new day, to the small moments of connection they shared. Whether it was a quiet breakfast together or a simple conversation as they worked, Jack realized how much he had come to depend on Rose's presence, how much he had come to rely on her in ways he hadn't expected. She had become more than just a companion. She had become part of the ranch, part of his life. As the months went by, the seasons changed again. The warmth of spring turned to the heat of summer, and the ranch continued to thrive. Jack and Rose had both found their place in the world, and though there were still challenges ahead, they knew they were ready to face them together. The ranch, once a lonely place, had become something more. It had become a home. And for the first time in a long time, Jack knew he was exactly where he was supposed to be.